Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to cut through some of the noise today, really unpack these dramatic recent events in the Middle East, specifically those Israeli strikes inside Iran that happened back in June 2025.
That's right. And we've dug into quite a stack of your sources, articles, various reports, even some, interesting online forum discussions.
Mm.
They cover a lot of ground, the strikes themselves, obviously, but also Iran's nuclear program, its missile capabilities, the cyber warfare angle, the impact of sanctions, which is always complex, and really importantly, the human side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So our mission here is to guide you through all this material. We want to help you understand what these sources are actually telling us about what's been happening, what's really driving this whole cycle, and why it matters, far beyond just the immediate region.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to getting up to speed on a really complicated and fast-moving situation.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
So the main event, the one documented across all these sources, happened in the early hours of Friday, June 13th, 2025. Reports detailing multiple explosions across Iran.
Right, and not just isolated bangs, right?
Yeah.
The material talks about blasts hitting Tehran, including areas near military bases, but also, kind of surprisingly, neighborhoods where senior commanders apparently live.
Yeah, that's a notable detail. And eyewitnesses, quoted in the sources, described seeing massive flames, repeated explosions. It sounds pretty intense.
And it wasn't just Tehran. The strikes also hit key sites outside the capital.
That's right. Sources specifically mention Natanz down in Isfahan province, home to that critical nuclear facility. And also blasts reported in places like Kondab and Karamabad.
So the targeting seems quite specific then, not random. According to the material, Israel was aiming at what it sees as Iran's most important military capabilities, with a definite focus on nuclear infrastructure.
Exactly. Natanz Enrichment Complex, the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center, those sites in Kondab and Karamabad. And they also reportedly hit an S-300 air defense system radar.
Okay, the radar hit is interesting, but before we get to that, casualties. The sources mention those too, tragically.
They do. Reports mention both military personnel and civilians. Specifically named casualties include IRGC Commander Major General Hussein Salami, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff Major General Mohammad Bagheri, and interestingly, two nuclear scientists, Ferdinand Abbasi and Mohammad Mehdi Taranchi.
Wow, those are some very senior names. Okay, back to the method. You mentioned the S-300 radar. Some sources highlight the specific radar targeted.
Yeah, this is quite fascinating. Some reports suggest they went for the S-300's shortest range radar, the one used for guiding interceptors close in, not the big one that spots threats way out.
Okay, so why do that? What's the thinking there, according to the sources?
Well, the suggestion is it was a deliberate signal, showing capability, showing intent, maybe hitting something valuable, but without completely blinding Iran's air defense network right away. Sort of a calculated move to avoid perhaps immediate massive escalation compared to taking out the main threat detection radar.
A specific calculated message. Though it's worth noting, you said some sources suggest this. Is there conflicting info?
There is, yeah. At least one source suggests a different method for one of the strikes, mentioning a missile potentially launched from Syrian airspace. It just, highlights how hard it is to get a completely clear picture in these situations. Fog of war, I suppose.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have the what and the where. Big question is why? Why now? What do the sources say about Israel's stated justification?
The IDF statement that's cited in the material, it's pretty direct. They pointed to intelligence suggesting Iran was getting dangerously close to what they called a point of no return with its nuclear program.
Point of no return. That sounds, well, final. What specific intelligence did the IDF reportedly highlight to back that up? What's in the sources?
Right. The material details claims that intelligence showed Iran producing thousands of kilograms of enriched uranium.
Right.
Also, actively developing these decentralized, hardened underground enrichment sites, getting the capability to enrich up to military grade levels very quickly, and crucially, making sort of concrete progress on actual weapons components for a bomb.
Components themselves. Not just the fuel.
Exactly. Israel apparently told the U.S. they saw this action as necessary self-defense based on that intelligence picture.
Okay, so Israel's stated reason revolves around that nuclear progress.
Yeah.
Let's pivot then to Iran's reaction. Not just the military posture, but specifically regarding the nuclear program itself, especially given some recent international developments mentioned in the sources.
Well, Iran's official response to the strikes was predictably strong. The General Staff of the Armed Forces called it an aggressive and adventurous act. They stated it targeted civilian and military areas, resulting in martyrs and injured, including women and children. And Ayatollah Khamenei also made public threats against Israel.
And there was that timing aspect too, right? The IAEA board finding Iran non-compliant literally the day before, June 12th.
Exactly. And sources report Iran reacted to that IAEA finding immediately, even before these June 13th strikes. They reportedly launched a new enrichment site and started installing more advanced centrifuges.
So a tit for tat on the nuclear front already underway.
Seems so. And the material also notes Iran had previously threatened, nuclear escalation if its program wasn't handled carefully by the international community, so the rhetoric was already there.
And beyond the nuclear file, Iran issued broader threats after the strike.
Oh, yes. Sources mention promises of a decisive response, vowing to forcefully respond to any transgression and to stop at nothing to protect its interests and people. Standard strong language, but also concerning.
And didn't one source mention a specific threat towards U.S. bases just before all this kicked off? Around June 11th?
That's right, yeah. A threat to strike U.S. bases in the region if a military conflict erupted specifically over the nuclear program. So tensions were already extremely high.
Which brings us back to the core issue, Iran's nuclear program. What's the status based on these sources? It has a long history, doesn't it?
It does. Goes way back to the 50s with U.S. help, ironically, paused, then restarted secretly in the 80s. Key sites like Natanz in Iraq got exposed in 2002, then the underground Fordo site in 2009.
And Natanz was the big one, housing thousands of centrifuges. Iraq's heavy water reactor, the IR-40, that was the plutonium route concern. Those sources say it was being redesigned under the JCPOA.
Right. And Fordo is dug deep underground. Plus the Tehran research reactor, using 20% enriched uranium, but mainly for medical isotopes, supposedly.
But the key point in the sources seems to be the recent advancements.
Absolutely. They emphasize the installation of advanced centrifuges, the IR-2-meter, IR-4, IR-6 models. These are much more efficient. And the really critical development was reaching 60% enrichment after that sabotage incident at Natanz back in April 2021.
And 60% is significant
because it's technically very close to weapons grade, which is usually around 90%. It's not a linear process. The jump from 60 to 90 is much quicker than getting to 60 in the first place.
Okay.
And by early 2023, sources estimated they'd stockpiled around 70 kilograms of this 60% enriched uranium. That accumulation is what makes analysts nervous, suggesting they could potentially produce enough material for a weapon relatively quickly if they made the political decision to do so.
Right, the breakout time concept. Okay, beyond nuclear, the sources also remind us about Iran's other capabilities, missiles, for instance.
Yeah, their missile program is significant. Active interest since the late 70s, early 80s. They use missiles extensively in the Iran-Iraq War.
And the sources mention various types?
They do. Ballistic missiles, long-range, medium-range, like the Shahab-3, shorter-range ones. And they also note the space launch capability, which always raises concerns about dual-use technology potentially applicable to intercontinental missiles. Those specifics are often debated, given the secrecy.
And the other major tool, the proxy strategy, the long arm, as some sources call it.
Right. That's primarily run by the IRGC's Quds Force, partnering with groups across the region, Hamas and Hezbollah being the most well-known. Though, interestingly, some sources we looked at suggest these networks might have weakened a bit recently or are under pressure. There's been some analysis questioning Iran's maybe inaction regarding Hezbollah in certain recent situations, but the overall goal remains extending influence beyond the Gulf.
Projecting power indirectly. Okay, let's step back a bit. Beyond the immediate events, what's the bigger picture emerging from these sources? You mentioned a shift earlier.
Yeah, I think maybe the most significant takeaway is this idea of a shift from a long-running, deniable shadow war into something much more like open warfare between Iran and Israel.
That feels like a really dangerous escalation.
It is. The sources suggest this wasn't just a one-off tactical strike, but potentially a real strategic change in the rules of engagement built up over decades.
And some sources attributed this partly to a miscalculation by Iran, a sense of arrogance.
That angle came up, yes. The idea that perhaps Iran felt it could fuel conflicts via its proxies, post-October 7th, coordinating groups in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq without the fire reaching Tehran itself.
They felt secure at home, even after some previous Israeli actions in 2024.
Apparently so, according to this line of analysis. Maybe assuming their senior commanders inside Iran were untouchable. These strikes would obviously shatter that assumption if true.
Another dimension heavily featured in the sources is cyber warfare. That front seems constantly active.
Very active. The sources detail activities of Iran-linked groups, APTs, advanced persistent threats, and also hacktivist groups.
And who are they targeting? It's not just Israel, is it?
No, it's broad. Israeli government, military, industry are primary targets, of course, but also foreign companies linked to Israel. And significantly, other Middle Eastern countries seen as supporting Israel recently. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE are mentioned.
Targeting specific sectors in those countries.
Yes. Things like tourism, exports, oil and gas, tech, finance. Basically, anywhere they can cause disruption or gather intelligence. Specific groups like APT-34 using PowerShell backdoors, APT-35 supposedly linked to the IRGC doing cyber espionage, spear phishing, and cyber aftringers focusing on industrial control systems are all mentioned.
And the risk isn't just state to state, right? The sources warn about businesses.
Explicitly. They warn that retaliatory cyber attacks could easily spill over and hit international businesses that operate in the region or even just have ties there. It's a globalized risk.
Okay, let's talk sanctions, always a huge factor. The sources offer a pretty nuanced view, it seems, not just sanctions work or sanctions fail.
Exactly. On one hand, they're presented as a tool, useful for signaling international resolve against proliferation, applying pressure.
But there's always a but with sanctions.
There is. The sources detail some pretty significant unintended consequences. They can, sort of paradoxically, end up empowering the hardline elements of the regime.
How so?
By allowing the government to tighten its control over the economy through patronage, shielding its allies from the worst effects, while the economic pain disproportionately hits the middle class and weakens more moderate voices, the very people who might favor better relations with the West down the line.
So hitting the middle class actually undermines potential future normalization.
That's the argument presented in some sources, yeah.
Yes.
It's that double-edged sword idea. You get leverage, maybe, but you might also be hurting the prospects for long-term change.
And the IRGC's role in the economy complicates this too, benefiting from black markets created by sanctions.
Precisely. Things like oil smuggling. When legitimate trade is blocked, illicit channels often controlled by powerful groups like the IRGC can flourish, mitigating the impact on the regime's core supporters and financials. It's not a simple pressure valve.
Fascinating. What about domestic factors inside Iran? Beyond sanctions, what internal pressures are highlighted?
Well, the sources point to ongoing internal security challenges. You know, the reverberations from the Masa Amini protests, but also the physical threats demonstrated by the assassinations of figures like President Raisi, Hamas leader Haniyeh on Iranian soil, and other targeted killings.
That must force the leadership to focus inward, surely.
Reportedly, yes, prioritizing domestic stability. Some analysts cited suggest this internal pressure might even lead to a bit more flexibility in foreign policy, though that's obviously debated. Others think it just makes them double down.
And then there are the chronic issues.
Yeah, institutional inefficiency, factional fighting within the elite, a lack of foreign investor confidence, all mentioned as hindering economic progress. The Chabahar Port project is cited as an example where potential hasn't been fully realized due to these kinds of internal hurdles.
Okay, turning to the Israeli side, briefly defenses. The sources mention their air defense system.
They do. Israel's multi-layered system, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow gets mentioned, particularly its performance during that large Iranian missile and drone attack in October 2024.
Where the US and UK also help significantly with interceptions.
Exactly. The system is described as sophisticated, able to detect threats and prioritize interceptions based on predicted impact zones, saving interceptors for things heading towards populated areas or critical sites.
Not foolproof, obviously, but credited with mitigating damage.
Significantly so, according to the reports. It's a key part of their strategic posture.
Now, amidst all this state-level strategy and conflict, you mentioned the human perspective. There was that anecdote from the online forum.
Yeah, it really brings it down to earth. It was from an online discussion, someone identifying as an Israeli parent. They were talking about the sheer anxiety, the fear of a potential massive missile attack, thinking about, like, 1,000 or 2,000 missiles getting through compared to maybe 189 in a previous large attack.
That's a terrifying prospect.
It is. And this person described feeling completely unprepared, almost frozen, debating whether they needed to leave the country with their family, just raw sadness and fear. But also the sense of, where do you even go? Leaving isn't simple and doesn't necessarily guarantee safety. It was a powerful reminder, seeking solidarity online, of the intense personal costs these geopolitical tensions have on ordinary people just trying to live their lives.
The very stark reminder. Okay, let's zoom back out to the international stage. How did the world react to these specific June 2025 strikes inside Iran?
Reactions were pretty varied, as you'd expect, but the general theme was urging restraint. The UN Secretary General called for maximum restraint, condemned any escalation.
And individual countries.
A real mix. Australia said it was alarmed. China advised caution. India was monitoring nuclear sites. Japan focused on diplomatic efforts. Then you had Oman directly blaming Israel. Saudi Arabia condemning the attacks as violations of international law. New Zealand called for de-escalation. So a spectrum of responses.
And the U.S. position. That's always crucial.
Right. The Secretary of State, according to the material, was very specific. The U.S. wasn't involved. Israel acted unilaterally in what it saw as self-defense, and Israel did inform the U.S. beforehand. Protecting U.S. forces in the region was stated as the top priority.
Within the U.S., politically, it wasn't uniform support.
No. Sources reported varied reactions there, too. Some supporting Israel's right to act, others calling it a reckless escalation that increased regional risks. The usual political divisions playing out.
And just before we wrap up the international part, you mentioned another Israeli military action around the same time in Syria.
That's right, just the day before the Iran strikes, June 12th. Sources mention an IDF ground operation in Syria, reportedly targeting Hamas members plotting attacks from there.
It just shows how interconnected all these fronts are, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Syria, Iran, Hamas.
Absolutely. It paints a picture of a very complex, interwoven regional security environment where actions in one theater can quickly impact another.
So bringing this all together, this deep dive into the sources, reveals, well, a really complex and, frankly, pretty concerning picture. We've covered the strikes themselves, the nuclear tensions Israel cited as the trigger, Iran's capabilities, missiles, cyber, proxies, the complicated impact of sanctions, Iran's internal dynamics, and that vital human cost.
Yeah, it really is a story of escalating tensions, strategic calculations being made on all sides with potentially incredibly dangerous consequences. And, as we discussed, that feeling of a shift from a hidden conflict towards something much more open and confrontational.
So to leave you, our listener, with something to think about. Considering everything we've unpacked today from these sources, the nuclear race, the proxy wars, the cyber domain, the economic pressures, the domestic politics, those deeply personal anxieties, what might be the single most unexpected thing, the unforeseen catalyst that could push this dynamic towards genuine de-escalation? Or, conversely, tip it over the edge into even wider conflict, something to ponder.